So, welcome back. Welcome back. It has been a little bit of a hiatus. I have been very busy with my lecturing as the semester has drawn to a close. So, I want to thank you for your patience as I've continued to get this YouTube channel up and running. If you're new to the channel, Professor for the People, please be sure to check out videos, look at some of my former content. Certainly, I would love for you to like and consider subscribing, but if anything, just look at some of these past lectures. I have a couple of really interesting topics that I've already lectured on. And as the semester is coming to a close, I will be able to put out multiple lectures per week. I've already had a few special requests from some students, so I'm really excited to be back. Now, this lecture, this is one of my all-time favorite lectures that I've given in victimology. It's a special topics lecture. And as I shared with you all when I started talking about victimology, and I want to say it was maybe it could have been my second video where I talked about a personal victimization that happened to me and my family. Basically, we understand and know that victimology is the study of the victim and their role in a criminal offense, as well as the response that a victim will have based on their victimization. And over the course of the semester, and I am someone who is essentially a specialist in victimology at the university that I'm at, I am the only professor that has lectured on victimology. I've been at other places where I was the only professor lecturing on victimology. So it is a field that is relatively near and dear to my heart based on how immersed I've been into this discipline. And I have a pretty unique background since I used to be in law enforcement too. With that being said, as we look at victimology and we see that, there's all sorts of victimizations, there's interpersonal violence, there is intimate partner violence, there is, theft and victimization of children and senior citizens. Of course, there's homicide victimization, and there's all sorts of victimizations. What I've done is I went ahead and I put together a very unique special topics lecture focusing on other types of victimization that we haven't touched on throughout the semester. And while we may have had little elements of it, what I've put together is so unique. And I always find that the students find this the most enjoyable lecture. And it's so fun for me getting to put this together. So now I'm very thrilled that all of you viewers and you subscribers, your family, your friends, again, I thank you so much for the support, that you will be able to see this final lecture that I've given to close out the semester, which focuses on escaping death, surviving psychopaths, serial killers, and more. Because there's a lot of other ways people have been victimized and can be victimized, and we want to go ahead and dive in. So let's have at it. So I want you to understand what is a serial killer, because it's not necessarily a fluid and easily defined definition. The FBI actually coined the term serial killer. So there was never any definition of a serial killer until the FBI came along. It's not a clinical definition. It is not a definition that is easily defined in terms of a clinician, a psychologist, as a psychiatrist has come out and given that definition. But the FBI, it's more or less a law enforcement definition. And so we see right here that it's a person who will take out two or more persons in the service of an abnormal psychological gratification. And these murders take place during two separate occasions. Now, I lecture on a topic called homicide. It's a very popular topic. I know there's a lot of people out there, not just subscribers, but there may be people that may come onto this page or might be interested in like, hey, what's this guy talking about? What's this professor talking about? Within the definition of a serial killer, it is very easy for individuals to confuse and think about, well, what about a mass killer? Or what about a spree killer? And those definitions are a little bit interchangeable. I'm sure that as the semester concludes and I have some downtime and I'm able to do more of my lectures, I'll jump in. Definition of a serial killer, a spree killer, and a mass murderer. And there are differences between those. But we'll come back to that at a later time. Criminologists do state that the murder should take place over more than a month. And there should be a significant period in between the murder. In fact, this period a class is known as the cooling off period. You ideally, law enforcement officials and criminologists think that the perpetrator should have a period of cooling off, because if they don't, that's where we get to our spree killer. They jump right in with no break in between. Why is this problematic? Well, it's easy. It's problematic because as time passes, it's going to be a little bit tougher to catch the individual. See, in homicide, I talk about serial killers, and I did a lecture. You can actually go back for those who are new to the channel and see the past lecture I did on serial killers. It's titled Psycho Killer. It can be very difficult to catch somebody as time passes. If a murder is committed, you want to get that perpetrator very quickly. Matter of fact, there's a famous TV show out there called The First 48. Law enforcement generally say those first 48 hours are the most crucial and critical hours to capturing that suspect. So understand that if we're dealing with a serial killer, we're not talking 48 hours, folks. We're talking a month, maybe a little bit more time, maybe a little bit less time, but we're talking about a cooling off period. And as that time passes, it might be very difficult to find out the serial killer's pattern, and certainly you might have more victims become available. So let's talk about this first individual, and I named this Terror on Campus, the Bundy Files. So Ted Bundy, over the course of 4 years, he kidnapped, he assaulted, he took out more than 30 women in 7 states, and when he took these people out, he had a very interesting ruse on how to make them leave this earth. What he would do is he would approach them in public places. He would act like he was hurt, and then he would just overpower them, and he would ultimately assault them. His method, his modus operandi, was to bludgeon them. And earlier in the semester, I had a lecture, a homicide victimization lecture, where I bring in forensic science elements, because I also have that background in forensic science too. And basically what he would do is he would beat them with any blunt object. A blunt object can be a pipe, it could be a heavy wooden stick, it could be a brick, but it's something that is blunt, and just bludgeon them, beat them over the head. Now, he would do some very disturbing things. I'm not going to read it out loud. You can certainly see this within the lecture. But that's what he would do to those victims until there wasn't anything left. This is a very disturbed, sick individual. And if I had a little more time, I would talk about the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath. But he definitely was a very deeply disturbed individual. So he exhibited 3 common traits found in serial killers. And serial killers have some common traits. There's other traits out there, such as they torture animals. Former investigator, FBI profiler Peter Klisman, he wrote a book that I read, which it was a common myth in some instances that some serial killers suffered from urinasis, but there was no factual proof behind that. But what's a common trait is the animal torture, or harming animal prey that seemed relatively weak. And that's what you see here, because he asserted himself through power. He was very manipulative, and he was certainly predatory. He would again prey on these women, making them and convincing them that he was a normal, upstanding citizen, only to do what he would do to them. And so his charm oftentimes fed into this narcissistic ego. Now, there are a bunch of different types of serial killers out there. There's the thrill killers and the visionary killers. There's power control killers. There's ideological serial killers. Again, I talk about this, so this is a nice little plug into a prior lecture, since if you're new to the channel, or if you are already subscribed, or you just stumbled upon it. You can go back and look at my Psycho Killer lecture. It's from my homicide class, and you can see these different types of serial killers. And so the power control killer is destined and motivated by dominating victims who they see as prey. Ted Bundy saw these women as nothing more than prey. And taking them out, committing murder was the most satisfying and final expression of power and control over those victims. So why was this called terror on campus? Now, I have ties to Florida, okay? I have ties to Florida. I went to school in Florida. I know about Florida State University. I've been on that campus when I was in law enforcement at an academy, not too far from there. So I at least know this area. In 1978, the campus was considered a very safe place. In fact, let me give you a little bit of quick history. Florida State used to be a women's college. You heard that right. There were no co-eds there. There were no men there. It was a women's college. And then eventually it became Florida State University. But Florida State becomes a beacon of horror. And Ted Bundy, after having escaped twice from authorities. So he jumped out of a courthouse second-story window, and then another time he crawled through a hole in the city, or a hole through a ceiling, He finds himself in Tallahassee, Florida. Now, Bundy was in the Midwest. And then for those of you who are fascinated by serial killers and you want to know more, Ted Bundy is a very fascinating individual. There's a lot of stuff out there on, different streaming services that you can look at and see, kind of his methods. There's actual archival footage of Ted Bundy being interviewed by journalists and criminologists. But Bundy operated in the West Coast. So he didn't even live in Florida. He was all the way out in Washington. He went to the University of Puget Sound where he was studying law. He was a very brilliant individual. But that brilliance is tried to, for a little period of time, to overshadow the monster that he was deep down inside in his heart. So he breaks into the Chi Omega home. He beats and strangles Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy to death. He brutally beats 3 more women, Cheryl Thomas, Kathy Kleiner, and Karen Chandler, with a blunt force object. Those women who went to Florida State University, whose parents loved them, hugged them, who maybe had brothers, who maybe had other family members, who joined the Chi Omega sorority house, they didn't think that night, January 5th, 1978, a monster from the Midwest was going to find his way into Tallahassee, Florida, and take out 2 of their sisters and brutally beat 3 others. They didn't know that. So when I ask the question, how do you survive a sadistic serial killer? Sometimes it's just pure luck. Sometimes it's nothing more than just pure luck. So this individual, Richard Ramirez, evil in the flesh. Ramirez had 3 of the most common traits found in serial killers. He had antisocial personality or antisocial behavior. In other words, he was definitely withdrawn from society. Richard Ramirez is another fascinating one. I'm telling you, most of these major serial killers, Richard Ramirez, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Eileen Wuornos, like they all, John Wayne Gacy, they all have so many documentaries out there. You can find it on any number of streaming services, but they have so many out there. And Ramirez is one that I'm essentially fascinated with because of the reign of terror that he had during his year or two of striking in California. But he was very much withdrawn. He lived on Skid Row out in California. He was doing odd jobs, didn't have any real stable job. He was kind of a creepy guy. It's just a lot about Ramirez. And so he definitely had this antisocial behavior, which again led to him being withdrawn. But he also liked to assert power, and he was predatory. He saw people as prey. Now, Ramirez had actually 2 combination types of serial killers. Again, we saw that Ted Bundy was a power control serial killer, but Richard Ramirez was what's called a thrill killer. He enjoyed the sport of killing, and he enjoyed the pain and suffering he would inflict on his victims. Now, one thing that was interesting, and I'm going to come back to this, and you might be like, whoa, what is he talking about with this guy talking about I love Satan? And if you look right here, you see he has a pentagram written in his the palm of his hand, and he has 666. We're going to get to that in just a moment, so just buckle up. He would make victims say, I love Satan. He would assault people and make them swear to Satan. He would tell them to say that the Night Stalker was here, and he'd run off into the night. And we are going to talk about what this all means in a moment, but it also showed that he was what was called a visionary killer, because he had delusions and a belief that he was commanded to kill. He was ordered to kill. This being, this higher being, was ordering him to kill. In fact, there's many documentaries out there where he literally says, I know there's an evil force out there. I know that there is a demonic force. It eludes me, but I believe in this force. And he's talking about Satan, the devil. So Ramirez, many people, mental health specialists, psychiatrists, psychologists, those who studied Richard Ramirez while he was on death row, they said that he was actually a made psychopath. In other words, he was made. He wasn't born that way. Now, that's a very controversial topic, and it's one that in my class, especially when I talk about theories and I talk about nature theory and nurture theory, are you nurtured this way? In other words, do people mold you to become a certain thing in life, or a certain criminal, or are you born that way under nature theory? The argument, controversial or not, is whether or not, if Ramirez was made, well, what are the factors that contributed to him being made? And here we go right here. First of all, he had a very violent childhood. Bookshelf falls on him, hits him in the head. Listen, your skull, your brain is very important. And just the slightest impact of trauma hitting you in the head, on your skull, on your brain, can cause irreparable damage. You have to be careful. And especially as a young boy, a child, your brain is not fully developed until you're 25. Many of the people that may be listening to this, certainly all my students, they're all under the age of 25. Their brains are still being developed. So there's that. The other thing is he was exposed to a substantial amount of violence from his cousin. His cousin was a Green Beret. Now look, I can be very personal here. My father served in the Vietnam War. He would tell me and my siblings about some of the horrors and atrocities that he dealt with in the Vietnam War. And he was in the army, so he was on the ground. He was exposed to a lot of stuff. Chemicals like Agent Orange and anything else. And again, I can save that for a whole different day. Understand that Richard Ramirez's cousin was a Green Beret. He was bad. He was like the baddest of the bad. You don't just walk in and say, I'm going to be a Green Beret. You go through rigorous training and testing to get that. And yet, his cousin, who was a Green Beret, serving the United States of America in the Vietnam War, was a serial killer. A serial killer, folks, by taking out and wiping out and offing Vietnamese women. He was doing that and took pictures. He took pictures of this. Like, how deranged was the cousin? And he would show these pictures to Richard Ramirez, who was a young boy. Name me a young person that could look at a gruesome picture of someone who is decapitated or disemboweled or missing limbs and think, wow, there's nothing of it. But Ramirez, after absorbing this through his eyes and through visually seeing this, eventually he idolized that cousin and thought that that was okay. You know, drugs, Ramirez was known to do hard drugs, LSD, acid, like some of the hardest drugs that are out there in society, especially in the 80s. He was very poor. He grew up very poor, and his parents didn't make much money. And also, going back to the violence, he was also beaten by his dad as well. So all of these psychosocial stressors literally made him into a psychopath or a serial killer. Ramirez definitely was a very disturbed and deranged individual. You know, you see right here in the comments, he would shoot someone in the head and they would wiggle and squirm all over the place. How do you get a girl to notice you? Pull out your gun. Like these are things that speak to his power, his use of force, the scare tactics, and more importantly, this predatory behavior that women and victims and anybody that was in his way in California for those several years in the 1980s were nothing more than prey to who? The Night Stalker. Now, a few minutes ago, we talked about Richard Ramirez drawing pentagrams in his hand, holding up his hand during the nationally televised trial and having people be like, wait a minute, what is that? What is this circle and a star? What is that pentagram? What does that mean? What is 666? Well, obviously he was a Satanist and he drew this not only on his hand, but he drew this on victims and on their walls. So that way people knew, law enforcement knew, detectives knew it was the Night Stalker. The number of the beast is 666. And this number is synonymous with darkness. You know, you don't go live at a house that is 666 Oakville Lane. You don't live at a house that's 1666, Mistletoe Way or something. And again, I'm just making up streets. It's like 666 is an evil number. Like, you can be 777, you can be 555, you can be 444, you can be 888. But if you be like, 666, that's a wrap. It's an evil number. It's the number of the beast. And so Ramirez brings Satanism to the forefront. A lot of people didn't understand Satanism and they didn't maybe know a whole lot about it. Satanism, witchcraft, black magic, dark magic, demonic summoning, all of that falls under the occult. What does the occult mean? That which is hidden. However, what I'm going to do as we talk about surviving more, since we talked about psychopaths, some of the people who survived Richard Ramirez, they got lucky. He let them live. He assaulted them and said tell people the Night Stalker was here. People who survived Ted Bundy, again, just pure luck. But now we want to talk about how do you survive other things? And so one of these other things are dealing with cults. Not the occult, which stands for that which is hidden. That's that Satanism, witchcraft, demonic summoning. Sometimes it's necromancy, dark magic, black magic, all that. That's the occult. We want to talk about cults and we want to look at their beliefs, their types of cults, and how they try to use mind control tactics to lure people in. So just remember, the occult stands for that which is hidden. That's the stuff that Richard Ramirez was in. We want to look at cults. And let me tell you, cults are very much visible. They may be hidden in the sense that they stay on a compound, but they are very much visible. So cults typically fall into three categories. We're going to go over the first one and the third one in just a moment. However, when we look at cults, the first type of cult is the religious cult. This is where you have a belief that there's a God, there's some higher being, but what happens is the leader will go ahead and reinterpret scripture themselves. If you go to church, if you have a religion that you follow, you know that you have a holy book that you read. And that holy book has been around for centuries, thousands of years, right? So understand that the leader is supposed to interpret that book and is supposed to make it known that they're leading people correctly and promptly so they don't stray away from the teachings and the belief of that particular religion. Well, the leader ends up kind of deviating from this. In other words, they will reinterpret scripture themselves and they will see themselves as the prophet or right hand of that God. It's dangerous, folks. It's very dangerous. That's a religious cult. Next, you have the political, racist, or terrorist cult. This is a cult that focuses on a few belief in a changing society. They think about a revolution, overthrowing a perceived enemy. They want to get rid of evil forces. This cult typically specializes in paramilitary style training. They'll equip members to battle at a moment's notice. There is a famous cult in Waco, Texas that I kind of feel like falls a little bit under this. Maybe not so much, but certainly, the paramilitary style training is a very important aspect of the political, racist, or terrorist cult. Also, you can also say terrorist groups like the Klan or some of those hate groups out there. Our last cult is the Doomsday Cult. And the Doomsday Cult focuses on how the end is near and there's going to be a catastrophe and an apocalypse. You better be ready, because when the world ends, you don't want to be here and you don't want to get left behind. What will happen is that the cult leader will tell you, I'm the one who has the ability to save you. I'm the one who has the ability to ensure that you don't perish, and I can prepare you for this self-fulfilling imminent prophecy. In other words, if you don't follow me, you're going to be like everybody else. You're going to be left behind. But if you follow me, I will ensure that you won't perish. That's the Doomsday Cult. And that cult is a very dangerous cult, just like the religious cult. So let's go over a religious cult. And many of you may have heard of that. But before we do that, understand that sometimes people in these cults, they have a weak spiritual background. I told the students just a few days ago, I said, you're not going to remember everything that your professor has talked about over the course of the semester, because it's a lot of material. It's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of material. But I said, if there's a couple of key takeaways that I want you to remember, please remember this. If you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. That's for anybody that watches this YouTube video, whether you're here in the United States, around the world, whether you're in New York or California, Idaho, Mississippi, Kentucky or North Carolina, wherever you are. If you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. Having a weak spiritual background is arguably the number one top factor that will contribute to someone joining a cult. Having the higher financial success, people with lots of money, people who are financially stable, they say, hey, this is exclusive. I only people that are in my social economic class can understand what this person is saying. I can support them. I can give them thousands and thousands of dollars to support the cause. Fewer time constraints. Individuals, sometimes people who are more busy don't have the time to go to the cult, but those who have a lot of free time, hey, they start seeing something. Next thing you know, they're going to cult meetings or meetings with the group that's perceived to be something else. And then now they're kind of in. Like, a lot of their time goes to being a part of that group. The higher level of education, absolutely. People who are so intellectually stimulated find themselves going with cults. That's why I named this the intellectual menace. It's one of my best titles of any type of part of a lecture, because cults are that. They're an intellectual menace. Typically, they will grab you intellectually. They will stimulate your mind. And then before you know it, you are hooked in without even understanding or realizing what is happening. Younger people fall into this category as well, although you'll see with certain other types of cults, older people will join, but younger people, because younger people are impressionable. They find themselves wanting to look for something that they don't understand, and if they don't have a spiritual background or they don't have a spiritual backing, they sometimes say, you know what, I definitely, I'm curious and I want to learn a little bit more about what you have to offer. And you'll see younger people do that because it's easy for them to pick up and go, as opposed to those who have families sometimes who can't just be there. But what I want to say is, you could be any ethnicity to join a cult. You can be black, you can be white, you can be Hispanic, you can be Asian, you can be indigenous, you can be anything to join a cult. Understand that cults are equal opportunity exploiters. They will do whatever they can to equally exploit that individual. So our first cult is a religious cult. And that religious cult was founded by Jim Jones. And Jim Jones was this very charismatic preacher. He founds this notorious cult in American history, and in some cases, maybe even the world, but he called it the People's Temple from 1955 to 1978. Now, the People's Temple was a new religious organization. It combined elements of Christianity with communism and socialist ideology. Now, let me stop right there. I know that in our society today, notwithstanding communism, but socialist ideology, there are individuals who argue and feel like, well, what is wrong with having social problems to help people get up in life, right? What's wrong with having programs that'll help them, purchase a house, programs that'll help them get out of debt or get out of student loan debt or whatever. And to some walks of life and to some people, they're like, yeah, I'm not, no. Jim Jones was ahead of his time. He really was. Back in the 50s through the 70s, he was ahead of his time because he was like, no, everyone needs to be equal. No, we all should be making the same. And so he placed a great emphasis on racial equality. He wanted to bring forth racial equality, and he wanted to show and highlight that it didn't matter what the color of your skin was. You could be equal. This is important, folks, because look at the dates. 1955 to 1978. We were just essentially getting kicked off and heavily into the civil rights era. The civil rights era being that period of time where you had significant turmoil throughout the country, particularly in the South, where a segregationist society wanted to remain segregated. They did not want people of color and minorities to integrate. And so Jones ends up bringing people together, talking about how the People's Temple was this catch-all, kumbaya, everyone together church. But he starts to drift because look at what he taught, folks. He taught this thing called the divine principle. He's saying that he was divine and that because you could see him, because you could talk to him, because you could touch him and feel him, he could be their God. That's what happens with religious cults. They take scripture, and he probably started off as a dynamic preacher, and he was a dynamic preacher, as you see from these two images down there. And there's a lot of stuff out there on Jim Jones, a lot. You can go look up Jim Jones. You can find lots of stuff on Jim Jones. He essentially took scripture and morphed it into what he wanted it to be. And because you could see him, he was their God. So what did he do? He gets shunned by left-wing ties in California. He felt like, hey, California's not understanding me. So he decides to move the group to Guyana. And he starts a new settlement named Jonestown. And while there, even though he had about 20,000 members who were a part of the People's Temple, about 3,000, about 3,000 to 5,000 members ended up going to Guyana. They picked up their belongings, left their house, left their apartments, sometimes even left their family. And next thing you know, they were in Guyana in this new settlement called Jonestown. And Jonestown was supposed to be this wonderful paradise. Lots of fruits, living off the land. It was going to be just this utopian paradise. But there's a little bit more to the story that meets the eye. You see, even though Jones felt like he had this great paradise, many people started to become fearful of what was going to happen there. What you find, and what was commonly found, was that Jim Jones started to get very delusional, and he started to get quite paranoid. And with his delusions and his paranoia, he started to think that people were out to get him. He started to think that somebody was coming to take away his settlement. Like, all of these things started to become commonplace. And that paranoia and that delusion will oftentimes lead to an impending doom in any cult, in any situation. So what happened was there were some members early on, before the delusion and the paranoia started to get out of control, there were some members who essentially escaped Jonestown, and they get back to the United States, and they immediately alert their congressman, Leo Ryan, who says, hey, something's going on here. You are a congressional leader. You were elected by the citizens of this particular city or congressional district in California to represent them. You probably need to go and investigate what's happening in Jonestown, because Jim Jones was putting pressure on the group, and he was even starting to hold people hostage. So all of a sudden, you were thinking, wait a minute, I'm here on my own free will. I'm here on my own free volition to be in Jonestown, in Guyana. I just want to go back to the United States. And he's like, no, you can't leave. So word starts to get out, and the people who did leave early on, before the paranoia and before the delusion started to kick in, they go and tell Congressman Leo Ryan. He takes a team with NBC cameras to Jonestown. They see, okay, it's not too bad. It's actually pretty nice what they're doing here. Until they start talking to some of the women and some of the younger girls saying, no, I'm not safe here. I don't want to be here. I want to leave and go home. And that infuriated Jim Jones. And this is what he ended up doing. You see, Jones ended up ordering a mass self-execution of nearly 900 People's Temple members, 300 of which included children. 300 children gone. Jones would have them engage in exercises where they would have to drink punch, and people didn't know if it was truly laced with cyanide poisoning or not. But he was saying, no, it was false alarm, but I wanted you to know. But after his members shot and executed Congressman Leo Ryan and others who were trying to flee from Guyana on the airstrip, no less, after the congressman was laid to rest, Jim Jones gets on his final announcement and say, the congressman is gone. We have to be done with this world. I'm sick of it. Let's be done with it. And many people were ordered to drink the cyanide punch. Some people were forcefully drank. In other words, they were held open, their mouth open, and it was poured down their throat, and they died. Others were injected. And Jim Jones took the cowardly way out on himself. You see, an individual who started off to be a beacon of light, an individual who started off to show care and compassion for people, equality during a civil rights era. 900 people. This man, this monster right here, was responsible for the demise of 900 people, 300 of which were children. Religious cult, intellectual menace, and that divine principle is what drew people in. Now, our second cult was a doomsday cult. And Marshall Applewhite, he was known as Doe. He was a religious leader. He also founded a religious cult, but again, they had more elements of the doomsday cult. So he believed in UFOs, and he presented to his followers about how they could be beamed up. In fact, they would go, beam me up, Scotty, or something like that. Or they would say, beam me up. And it was taken as a ploy on Star Trek, where many people from Star Trek would get beamed up to the Starship Enterprise. Well, he said that, listen, UFOs will take them away, their people away, because they're a chosen people. They're only picking chosen people. And even though Marshall Applewhite, or Doe, had a dictatorial demeanor, some people thought he was laid back and fatherly. Now, you can be the judge. This is what he looked like. Now, this guy looks a little bit, he's a little wide-eyed, right? But the point is that Applewhite, he gets a group of people. And even when he's talking, he's like, we're a cult. We're the cult of cults. Like, he literally did that in one of the video clips that I saw and had showed with my class. He's not hiding what they are. And yet people still believed this guy and still followed him. So Heaven's Gate was a new religious movement. They were a cult. They included a mixture of Christian millennial beliefs, New Age ideology, and ufology, which characterized UFOs as a religion. Now, the group believed that followers can transform themselves into immortal extraterrestrial beings. They were going to reject their human nature. And then in order to ascend to heaven, they saw heaven as the next level. Now, the ultimate message for ascension was as follows. The Hale-Bopp comet would bring them closer to Heaven's Gate. In fact, they said that they would leave this plane and evacuate Earth, and they would take a spacecraft that was following the comet. So you couldn't see the spacecraft behind the comet. And as you look on your right, that's the Hale-Bopp comet. But Marshall Applewhite, Doe, he could see it. And so Doe would say, hey, if you follow me, you could take the spacecraft that no one else can see to get to the next level. He also believed that the world was going to eventually end, and they wanted to get to Heaven's Gate, because you can't just get to Heaven's Gate unless you take this spacecraft. And these people believed. But here's what was fascinating. This is just the catch. They argued that to ensure that nothing goes wrong, because, something can happen. We could, be getting beamed up, and maybe we missed the spacecraft. Maybe an alien spacecraft takes us. If something went wrong with the ascent, they purchased alien abduction insurance that would cover up to 50 members and would pay each person $1 million if abducted. Let me repeat, $1 million would get paid to a person if abducted. Now, I have to ask you, and I want you to think about this, and I certainly have to ask myself this question. Who's going to believe this? Who's going to believe this? You're paying for alien abduction insurance. Who was the person who sold them the alien abduction insurance, number one? And number two, how could these individuals believe this? How could they believe that a comet, the Hale-Bopp comet, that's traveling through space and is going to go by Earth, there's a spaceship behind it that they can't see, that no NASA scientist could see, but only Marshall Applewhite can see it, and he's going to get them on that spaceship. Who would believe this? Remember what I talked about? Remember that cults are the intellectual menace? Remember that people with higher education, lots of money, weak spiritual background can believe stuff? How are they going to get a seat on the spaceship? Well, I won't put the image in here. But these were all of the people who were taken from this earth. These were all of the people who denied their personal identity, shaved their heads, some even castrated themselves, had a uniform to make themselves look like everybody. They all believed that. They also took the punch, drank the punch, took the injection, that they would be on this spacecraft on their way to heaven. And it's sad because as you look through these individuals, they were engineers, they were lawyers, they were very brilliant scientific minds. One individual, his sister, was on Star Trek. She had a starring role on Star Trek. They had so much life, and yet they believed Marshall Applewhite, a man practicing intellectual menace, by convincing them that they needed to end their lives in order to get onto that spacecraft so they can go to heaven. It's sad. It's tragic, and it's nothing more than a waste. Nothing more than a waste of human lives at the expense of one man. So, what are people generally afraid of? Okay, some people did survive the People's Temple. They ran through the jungle 30 miles. One woman talked about she ran 30 miles, fearful that she was being followed, until she made it to the nearest city, and she told them what happened. People that survived Heaven's Gate just left the cult through their own free will, and that's how they survived. But nobody who was present the day of the mass execution survived. When we look at a phobia is an extreme or irrational fear of or aversion to something. Now, phobias can be uncontrollable. You might have a fear of an object, a fear of a situation, or a fear of an activity. Some people are fearful of crowds. It's called, agoraphobia. Some people are fearful of clowns. It's called coulrophobia. Some people might be afraid of or fearful of spiders, arachnophobia. When you see that thing that causes you that persistent fear, it can cause a deep sense of panic or dread once the person comes into contact with the source. Now, general anxiety disorder, something I talked about a couple of weeks ago, phobias are connected to something specific. What is that specific thing that will make you afraid? Well, here's mine. Snakes. And look, I figured I would bring this little toy snake to be a little bit fun. This is my son's snake. I'll kiss it. Would never do that on a real snake now. But listen, there are people who have no problem with snakes. Some people are like, oh, it's a snake, cool. Others are like, no, thank you. And this is my fear. This is a coral snake. And so this is one of the second deadliest poisonous snakes in the entire country. And that was slithering through my backyard in Florida. So like I told the story to the students, I was out there admiring my grass, even though I was a young man, a lot younger than what I am now. And then I saw that and I was like, what is that? And I quickly killed it. And then I took photos and sent it into the local university. And they were like, yeah, that's somewhat normal. It's nothing to be afraid of. Thankfully, it wasn't like a small snake. But yeah, if you see another one, just, do what you got to do. You could even leave it alone. It won't bother you, but I don't mess with that because coral snakes, this type of snake, and I've had this picture now for a decade plus, it's nothing to mess around with. Many snakes are nothing to be cute with. So like I said, I'm holding this little toy snake right here, and this is a little green garden snake that my son has. But my fear is snakes, and that fear of snakes is called ophidiophobia. Ophidiophobia. It's a fear of snakes. I am very scared of snakes. If I see a snake, I'm going to react pretty quickly. I'm not going to panic, and I'm not going to be like frozen. I'm going to react quickly, like you see how I broke my shovel. But ophidiophobia is my fear of snakes. Absolutely. So when we look at other dangers, people surviving automobile or vehicular accidents, I mean, if you live in a major city around the country, you might have more cars. More cars equals more population. More population means more likelihood of accidents. Some people have survived car accidents, and it's very traumatic. Plane crashes, you have all sorts of shows on different cable networks or on different streaming sites where individuals talk about surviving plane crashes. What about animal attacks? As you see down here, the most dangerous and most common animal attack over the last 50 years, it's not snakes. Snakes are right up there, 57 fatalities. It's not even sharks. It's brown bears. And I had a student the other day say, oh no, professor, brown bears, listen, they are fast. You might go, oh yeah, that thing's not fast. I'm quick. No way. No, they are fast. And if you see a brown bear cub, you have to assume that mama bear is like maybe 5, maybe 10 feet away. So don't be like, oh, that's a cute cub. She will go ballistic on you. Don't tempt it. But you have other things in there like the black bear and alligators and polar bears in cold climates. So obviously see that the brown bear yields the most fatalities of any other animal. And so the last thing, and then I'll wrap up. While any animal can be dangerous because you can't control what an animal is going to do. I mean, you can train an animal, but you can't fully control an animal. You have chimpanzees, you have coyotes, you have bobcats. You have a lot of different animals that are dangerous, right? But dog attacks are the most common animal attack in society because dogs are, referred to as man's best friend, and they are the most domesticated animal that exists. The debate is going to continue that it's not the breed of the dog that's dangerous. It's how the dog is trained. Now, we know there are certain breeds that get stigmatized. Growing up, we had a Doberman Pinscher. Growing up, we had a Golden Retriever. But there's other breeds that when you say that breed's name, you go, oh, that's going to be a dog. That's going to be dangerous. Think about a pit bull. Think about a Rottweiler. Think about a German Shepherd. Those dog breeds are breeds that immediately invoke fear. It's not it's not the breed of the dog that's the issue. It's how that dog was trained. How dangerous that dog is how they were trained. And so we know dog attacks can be fatal, but surviving an attack can have lasting consequences. People who have survived chimpanzee attacks, people who have survived other animal attacks, sometimes they are never the same. Sometimes their life is so changed and challenged that they may be disfigured, they may not be able to use all their bodily functions, and they are just trying to have some semblance of a normal life. The question I'll leave you with as I wrap up is, if a dog attacks a human, who's responsible for that attack? The owner. Because again, it's not the breed of the dog, it's how that dog was trained. So I want to thank you for listening to this special topic lecture, Surviving Psychopaths, Serial Killers, and More. Please be sure to, again, if you like what you hear, be sure to look at other lectures. If you still like what you hear, I would always appreciate the likes, I would appreciate the subscriptions, and I would appreciate the shares. Share with your family. Share with your friends. You may have a friend out there that might be in a different discipline. They could be an adult, they could be a student, they could be a high school student, and they may say, yeah, this is pretty fascinating. It's really interesting, because my whole goal as a professor is I want to teach you stuff that you may not know, or teach you some things that you might know, but I want to expand upon your knowledge. So I want to thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your support. And as always, I'll see you next time.